Have you ever held a piece of paper in your hands that felt heavier than it should? Not because of the ink or the fancy seal from a university, but because of the weight of the dreams and sacrifices pressed into its very fibers. I remember holding my diploma, the culmination of 4 years of relentless study and my parents' lifetime of backbreaking work. It was supposed to be a key, the one thing that would unlock a door to a life they never had. A life away from grease-stained hands and calloused fingers. I was Eleanor Vance, and that piece of paper was my promise to them, a promise I intended to keep right here, in my hometown of Oak Haven, Ohio. Oak Haven wasn't a bustling metropolis. It was a town built around the steady hum of a single, colossal entity, Sterling Manufacturing. The factory was the town's heart, pumping life and livelihood through its streets. My father, bless his soul, spent 40 years of his life as a mechanic in a small garage on the edge of town, fixing the very trucks that service Sterling's. He'd come home every evening smelling of oil and metal, his hands a permanent shade of gray, but his eyes would light up when he saw my report cards. My mother was a seamstress, her fingers nimble and quick, working from our small living room, mending the clothes of the very people who worked at the factory. They were a team, a quiet, resilient force, and their entire focus was on me. "You're going to use your mind, Ellie," my father would say, gently tapping my forehead with a finger that was surprisingly soft despite its rough appearance. "Not just your hands." University was their dream for me, and I made it my mission. I was the first in our family to go. The day my acceptance letter arrived, my mother wept silently into her apron, and my father, a man who rarely showed emotion, took a long walk by himself, coming back with his eyes just a little red around the edges. They took out a second mortgage on our little house, the only home they'd ever known. They sold my grandmother's old jewelry. My mother took on extra mending jobs, often working late into the night under the glow of a single lamp, her silhouette a portrait of devotion. I studied business administration, not because it was my passion, but because it felt practical. It felt like the surest way to honor their sacrifice, to get a good job back home, to finally let them rest. When I graduated with honors, the pride in their eyes was a beacon. Coming back to Oak Haven wasn't a retreat, it was the whole point. I didn't want to disappear into some big, anonymous city. I wanted to be here, to buy my parents a nicer house on the other side of town, to take care of them the way they had always taken care of me. My plan was clear, almost laughably simple in its optimism. I would apply for the management trainee program at Sterling Manufacturing. It was a coveted position, a direct path to the corporate offices that sat gleaming on the hill overlooking the factory floor where so many of our neighbors toiled. I spent a week perfecting my resume, my cover letter a carefully crafted love letter to Oak Haven, and my ambition to contribute to its primary institution. I listed my qualifications, my GPA, my internships. I felt a surge of confidence. This was it. This was what it was all for. I dropped off my application in person, handing it to a secretary who looked at me over her glasses with a bored expression. But I didn't care. I had done everything right. I had followed the rules of the world they told me existed. Work hard, get your education, and the doors will open. A few weeks later, the call came. They wanted to see me for an interview. I remember my mother helping me pick out an outfit, a simple, navy blue suit she had altered herself to fit me perfectly. "Look the part, Ellie," she whispered, her hands smoothing the fabric on my shoulders. "Show them what a Vance can do." My father gave me a rare hug that morning, his grip tight. "You've got this," he said, his voice thick with emotion. The interview was with the general manager himself, a man named Mr. Albright. His office was on the top floor, a world away from the clatter and grime of the factory below. The carpet was so thick my heels sank into it. The air smelled of leather and polish. Mr. Albright was a man in his late 50s, with a perfectly coiffed silver hair and a smile that never quite reached his eyes. He glanced at my resume, his finger tapping a manicured nail on the polished surface of his enormous mahogany desk. He asked me a few perfunctory questions about my studies, about my goals. I answered each one with the earnest, well-rehearsed passion of a young woman who believed she was on the precipice of her destiny. I spoke about efficiency models, about modernizing supply chains, about employee morale initiatives. I poured out all the knowledge I had spent 4 years and a mountain of debt acquiring. I thought it was going well. He nodded along, that same placid smile fixed on his face. When I finished, a hopeful silence filled the room. I waited for him to say something encouraging, to perhaps schedule a second interview. He leaned back in his leather chair, the leather groaning in protest. He picked up my resume, holding it between his thumb and forefinger as if it were a curious, slightly distasteful object. And then he grinned, a wide, predatory grin that finally made his eyes light up, but with a cold, dismissive amusement. He looked me straight in the eye, the girl in the perfectly tailored suit, the daughter of the mechanic and the seamstress, the first of her family. And he said the words that would echo in my mind for years, the words that would shatter the foundation of everything I believed in. "Your degree isn't relevant, sweetheart," he grinned, tossing my resume onto the desk like a piece of trash. "My cousin's got this." The world seemed to tilt on its axis. For a moment, I was sure I had misheard him. The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating. Sweetheart. The condescension in that single word was a slap in the face, more stinging than any physical blow. It reduced me, my 4 years of dedication, my parents' monumental sacrifice, to nothing more than a naive girl playing dress-up in the world of men. My cousin's got this. The casual, unapologetic nepotism was so blatant, so raw, it stole the breath from my lungs. I just sat there, my hands clenched into tight fists in my lap, the navy blue suit suddenly feeling like a costume. My carefully prepared answers, my talk of supply chains and efficiency models, all of it felt utterly foolish. I had come in armed with knowledge and ambition, ready for a fair contest, only to find out the race had been fixed from the very beginning. Mr. Albright's cousin. I didn't even know his name. He was just a shadow, a faceless benefactor of a system I was too innocent to understand. I don't understand, I managed to stammer, my voice a weak, trembling thing. Mr. Albright's grin softened into a look of feigned pity, which was somehow even more insulting. "Look, Eleanor," he said, leaning forward as if sharing a great secret. "This is a family company. We take care of our own. Your little degree is nice, a nice piece of paper. But experience, real-world experience, and loyalty, that's what matters here." He didn't bother to mention what experience his cousin had. He didn't have to. The message was clear, my kind of loyalty, the loyalty of hard work and merit, was worthless. The only loyalty that mattered was the one written in bloodlines and backroom deals. He stood up, a clear dismissal. "Thank you for coming in. We'll keep your resume on file." It was a lie, and we both knew it. My resume was already forgotten, a casualty of a battle I never had a chance to win. I stood up on unsteady legs, my face burning with a mixture of shame and a white-hot, unfamiliar anger. I didn't say another word. There was nothing to say. I turned and walked out of his office, through the plush-carpeted hallway and into the elevator. As the doors slid shut, my reflection stared back at me, a pale, stunned girl whose hopeful light had been extinguished. The ride down felt like a descent into a new, colder reality. I walked out of the gleaming corporate building and into the afternoon sun, which now felt harsh and unforgiving. The hum of the factory below sounded different now, not like a heartbeat, but like the grinding of a machine that chewed up people like me and spit them out. The walk home was the longest of my life. Every step was a heavy reminder of my failure. How could I face them? How could I tell my father, who had such unshakable faith in the fairness of a hard day's work, that it was all a lie? How could I tell my mother, who had poured her love into every stitch of my suit, that it had been nothing but armor for a phantom fight? When I opened the front door to our small house, the familiar smell of baking bread and my mother's sewing machine oil wrapped around me. My mother was in the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron, her face anxious and full of hope. "Well, how did it go, my love?" I opened my mouth to speak, to pretend, to soften the blow, but all that came out was a single, ragged sob. And then I was collapsing into her arms, the whole story tumbling out between gasps and tears, the words sweetheart and my cousin's got this feeling like poison on my tongue. She held me, stroking my hair, not saying a word. She just let me cry until there were no tears left. My father came in from the garage, his face etched with concern. He stood in the doorway, listening, and I watched the light in his eyes dim, replaced by a weary, profound sadness that I knew was not for him, but for me. For the world he had hoped I would inherit, which had turned out to be just as cruel as the one he knew. That night, no one said much. My father sat in his armchair, staring at the television without seeing it. My mother made my favorite dinner, but none of us could eat. The diploma, which had been sitting proudly on the mantelpiece, now seemed to mock me from its frame. The weeks that followed were a blur of quiet humiliation. News travels fast in a town like Oakhaven. Soon, I saw him, the cousin. A young man named Scott Albright, a few years older than me, known around town for being more interested in fast cars than hard work. He was driving a new company car, wearing a suit that was far more expensive than mine. People would nod at him with a respect that was bought and paid for by his last name. When they saw me, they'd offer a pitying smile or quickly look away, as if my disappointment was contagious. I couldn't stay home and wallow. My parents' silent worry was too much to bear. I needed to do something, anything. I started applying for other jobs, sending my polished resume to smaller companies in neighboring towns. But the responses were few and far between. The economy wasn't great, and my pristine business degree seemed overqualified for the secretarial jobs and underqualified for the few management positions that existed, which always seemed to go to someone with more experience. My savings dwindled. The weight of my student loans felt like a physical burden. Finally, defeated, I walked into the Corner Perk, Oakhaven's only diner, and asked if they were hiring. Martha, the owner, a woman with a perpetually tired face and a kind heart, looked at me, then at my hands, which were soft and uncalloused. Can you handle a 6-hour shift on your feet, dear? It's not like university. I can, I said, my voice firm, trying to project a confidence I no longer felt. And so, my new life began. I, Eleanor Vance, with a Bachelor of Business Administration with honors, became a waitress. I traded my navy blue suit for a cheap polyester apron that always smelled faintly of fried onions. I learned to balance 3 plates on one arm, to smile at rude customers, to mop up spilled coffee. My colleagues were women who had been working jobs like this their whole lives. There was Brenda, a single mother putting 2 kids through school, and Carol, who was my mother's age, saving up for a knee replacement. They were kind, but there was an invisible wall between us. They saw me as the girl who was supposed to have escaped this life, not joined it. Every day felt like a performance. I would go to work, put on my smile, and serve coffee to the very men in suits who worked at Sterling Manufacturing, men who would leave a $1 tip and not even look me in the eye. Sometimes, Scott Albright and his friends would come in, laughing loudly, treating me with the same casual condescension his cousin had. "Hey, sweetheart, can we get another round of coffee over here?" he'd call out, snapping his fingers. Each time, it was a fresh wound. I would just nod, refill their cups, and walk away, my knuckles white as I gripped the coffee pot. My parents never once said, "I told you so," or "what a waste." But I saw the toll it was taking on them. My father seemed to age a decade in a few months. My mother's hands, already worn from her work, seemed to tremble more. They had poured their life's energy into launching me into a new orbit, only to watch me fall right back to where I started. The guilt was a constant, heavy cloak. I felt like I had not only failed myself, but I had invalidated their entire life struggle. This wasn't just my hardship. It was a shared, familial sorrow, a dream that had died for all of us on the top floor of the Sterling building. The diner became my world. The clatter of plates, the hiss of the griddle, the constant murmur of conversations, it was the soundtrack to my disillusionment. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The girl who had dreamed of optimizing corporate structures was now optimizing the arrangement of ketchup bottles on the counter. The ambition that had once burned so brightly within me had been banked down to a low, smoldering ember of resentment. I was trapped, not just in a job I hated, in a town that felt like a cage, but within the prison of my own shattered expectations. My only solace came from an unlikely source. Her name was Agnes, a woman in her late 60s who worked the early morning shift, preparing the batter and baking the pies. She had been at the diner for over 30 years. Agnes was a woman of few words, with eyes that had seen everything and judged nothing. She had a quiet dignity that the polyester uniform couldn't diminish. She never asked me about my past or my degree. She just observed. One afternoon, during a lull, I was sitting in a booth, staring blankly at the worn-out linoleum floor. I was replaying Mr. Albright's words in my head for the 1000th time. Agnes came and sat opposite me, placing a cup of tea on the table. "You carry it around like a sack of rocks," she said, her voice raspy from a lifetime of cigarettes she'd given up years ago. I looked up confused. "Carry what?" "That anger," she said, her gaze steady. "It's heavy, and it's not doing you any good. They don't feel the weight of it, you know. Only you do." Tears pricked my eyes. It was the first time anyone had named the emotion that was eating me alive. It wasn't just sadness or disappointment. It was a deep, corrosive anger at the injustice of it all. "What am I supposed to do?" I whispered. "Just forget it? Pretend it didn't happen?" Agnes took a slow sip of her own tea. "Forgetting is for the weak. You don't forget. You just decide where to put it. Right now, you're carrying it on your shoulders. It's slowing you down, making you bitter. You could put it under your feet instead. Use it as a stepping stone." She paused, her eyes scanning the diner. "There's more than one way to use a good mind, Eleanor. Not all of them are in a fancy office on a hill." Her words didn't magically solve my problems, but they planted a seed. A stepping stone. The idea was foreign to me. I had only ever seen my situation as a pit I had fallen into. I started watching the diner not as a waitress, but as an analyst. I began to notice the inefficiencies I had been too miserable to see before. Martha, the owner, was kind, but she was overwhelmed. The ordering system was chaotic, leading to wasted food. The staff scheduling was a mess, often leaving us short-handed during the lunch rush. The bookkeeping was a shoebox full of receipts. It was a small business slowly drowning in its own disorganization. Hesitantly, I started to act. It began with small things. After my shift, I'd stay for an extra half hour and organize the receipts from the shoebox into neat piles, dated and categorized. Martha noticed, but didn't say anything. Then I started tracking the daily specials, noting which ones sold out and which ones were always left over. I created a simple chart and showed it to her. "Maybe we could make the meatloaf on Tuesdays instead of Fridays, Martha," I suggested. "We seem to get more of the factory lunch crowd then." She looked at me, then at the chart, a flicker of surprise in her tired eyes. "Well, she mumbled. "Give it a try." We tried it. The meatloaf sold out by 1 o'clock. Slowly, I started applying the principles from my expensive education in the most unlikely of classrooms. I designed a simple inventory system using a spiral notebook, reducing our food waste by nearly 20% in the first month. I created a new staff schedule that better matched our customer flow, easing the stress on everyone and improving service. I wasn't asked to do any of it. I just did it quietly in the background. The anger Agnes had spoken of was still there, but now it had a new purpose. It was fuel. Every organized receipt, every efficient schedule, was a silent act of defiance. It was me proving to myself that my mind, my education, was not irrelevant. Martha began to rely on me for more than just waiting tables. She'd call me into her tiny, cluttered office. "Ellie, what do you think about this supplier, or can you look at these numbers for me? They don't make sense." I became her unofficial business manager. I wasn't getting paid any extra, but something was happening to me. The heavy cloak of victimhood was starting to feel a little lighter. I was building something, fixing something. My work had meaning again, even if it was a world away from the corporate glory I had once craved. My parents noticed the change. The spark was returning to my eyes. I'd come home and talk about sales figures and inventory control instead of rude customers. My father would listen intently, a small, proud smile playing on his lips. He didn't understand the business jargon, but he understood the language of purpose. He saw that his daughter was fighting back, not with fists or angry words, but with the tool he had always believed in, her mind. One day, about a year and a half after I started at the diner, Martha called me into her office and closed the door. She looked more tired than usual, but also resolute. "Ellie," she began, "I've been running this place for 40 years. My husband and I, we built it from nothing. But he's gone now, and I'm done." My heart sank. I thought she was going to tell me she was selling the place, that my small, fragile world was about to be upended again. "I've been watching you," she continued, ignoring my worried expression. "You have a head for this. You see things I stopped seeing years ago. You've turned this place around, and you haven't even been trying to." She took a deep breath. "I'm retiring. I want to sell the diner." "Oh, Martha," I said, my voice filled with genuine sadness for her and a selfish fear for myself. "Who are you selling to?" She looked me straight in the eye. "I'm selling to you, Eleanor." I laughed. It was a hollow, incredulous sound. "Me? Martha, I have maybe $200 in my savings account and a mountain of student debt. I can't buy a pack of gum, let alone a restaurant." "I know what you have," she said patiently. "I'm not a fool. I'm not asking you to pay me a lump sum. I've spoken to the bank. I'll owner finance it. You'll pay me back in installments, out of the profits. The profits I know you can make." She pushed a folder across the desk. "I had a lawyer draw this up. It's a fair deal. It's the only deal I'm offering. The diner is yours, or it closes." I stared at the folder, then at her face. Her expression was serious, unwavering. It was an act of incredible faith, a faith that no one, not even myself, had shown in me for a very long time. It was a different kind of door opening, not one I had ever thought to knock on. It wasn't a gleaming corporate entrance, but the well-worn, humble door of a small-town diner. But this time, the key wasn't a piece of paper. It was the trust of a woman who had seen my worth when I was at my lowest. The weight of that trust felt even heavier and far more precious than my diploma ever had. Holding that folder in my hands felt like a moment of impossible gravity. It was a lifeline, but it was also terrifying. The thought of owning a business, of being responsible for its success or failure, for the livelihoods of Agnes, Brenda, and Carol, was overwhelming. My dream had been to be a cog in a large, stable machine, not the person who had to build and maintain the entire engine. That night, I sat at our small kitchen table with my parents and laid the folder between us. I explained Martha's offer, my voice trembling with a mixture of excitement and sheer panic. My father, who had been so quiet and withdrawn for so long, read through the documents with a careful, methodical focus, his finger tracing the lines of legal text. My mother watched him, her hands clasped together, her face a canvas of hope and worry. When he was done, he closed the folder, placed his rough, mechanic's hand on top of it, and looked at me. The weariness in his eyes had been replaced by a fierce, protective fire. "He told you your degree wasn't relevant," my father said, his voice low and steady. "He didn't need to say Mr. Albright's name. He was wrong. He just didn't want it to be. This," he tapped the folder, "this is where it becomes relevant. Not for them. For you. For us." My mother reached across the table and took my hand. "We believe in you, Ellie. We always have." In that moment, their faith was the only collateral I had. We talked late into the night, not about the risks, but about the possibilities. My father, a man of practical skills, started sketching out ideas for fixing the leaky faucet in the kitchen and reinforcing the worn floorboards. My mother, with her eye for detail and warmth, talked about new curtains and maybe putting fresh flowers on the tables. They weren't just supporting my new venture, they were becoming a part of it. The dream that had died was being reborn, not as a corporate fantasy, but as a family mission. I signed the papers the next day. The corner perk became Ellie's Place. The first few months were the hardest of my life. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by coffee and adrenaline. I was the first one in, baking with Agnes before the sun came up, and the last one out, poring over the books long after the last customer had gone home. I learned to negotiate with suppliers, to handle payroll, to unclog a blocked sink. Every challenge was a lesson. My business degree wasn't just theory anymore, it was a survival guide. I used my knowledge of marketing to create a new logo and run specials that brought in families on weeknights. I used my understanding of human resources to create a small profit-sharing program for the staff, giving them a real stake in our success. The town watched, curious. At first, some were skeptical. The girl who couldn't get a job at the factory was now running a business? But then they saw the changes. The food was better, the service was faster, the atmosphere was warmer. My mother's handmade curtains added a touch of home, and the fresh flowers she insisted on became our signature. My father spent his weekends at the diner, fixing anything that was broken, his toolbox a familiar sight. He never looked happier. Ellie's place was no longer just a diner, it was becoming the new heart of Oak Haven. It was a place where people felt welcomed and cared for, not just served. Years began to pass, painted in the colors of changing seasons outside the diner's large front window. We expanded, knocking down a wall into the empty storefront next door. We added a small bakery counter, selling Agnes's famous pies, which now had a reputation that stretched to the next county. Brenda's kids, now in high school, worked for me on weekends, saving up for college. Carol finally got her knee replacement, and I made sure her job was waiting for her when she recovered. We were more than a staff. We were a mismatched, resilient family. I had finally been able to buy my parents that nicer house, a small cottage with a garden for my mother and a proper workshop for my father. Seeing their peace and happiness was a success far deeper than any corporate title. One crisp autumn afternoon, about a decade after that fateful interview, the bell above the diner door jingled. I looked up from the counter where I was arranging a display of fresh apple turnovers. An old man stood there, looking frail and uncertain. It took me a moment to recognize him. It was Mr. Albright. The silver hair was thinner now, the expensive suit replaced by a simple tweed jacket that hung loosely on his frame. The arrogant grin was gone, replaced by the tired, vacant look of a man who had been defeated by time. He didn't recognize me at first. I was no longer the scared girl in the navy suit. I was a woman in her 30s, wearing an apron dusted with flour, my hands strong and capable, my face etched with the lines of hard work and laughter. He ordered a coffee and a slice of pie, his voice a mere shadow of the booming authority I remembered. I served him myself. As I placed the plate in front of him, our eyes met. A flicker of recognition crossed his face, followed by a wave of discomfort. "Eleanor?" "Eleanor Vance," he murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "Hello, Mr. Albright," I said, my voice calm and even. There was no anger, no triumph. The sack of rocks Agnes had talked about was long gone, having been used to build the very foundation I now stood upon. He looked around the bustling diner, at the happy customers, at the warm, inviting space. He looked at me, the owner, the boss, a woman in complete command of her world. The irony of it all hung in the air between us. Sterling Manufacturing had fallen on hard times. A series of bad decisions, poor leadership, rumor had it his cousin Scott had been a disaster in management, had led to layoffs and downsizing. The gleaming building on the hill was no longer a symbol of power, but of decline. He just nodded slowly, a deep, weary resignation in his eyes. "I'll be," he said to himself. "I'll be." He drank his coffee in silence, paid his bill, and left without another word. I watched him go, a stooped figure disappearing down the street. I felt no satisfaction in his decline, only a profound sense of peace. My journey had been nothing like the one I had planned. It had been forged in rejection, shaped by hardship, and built with my own two hands in the very place I had once felt so trapped. I had been denied a seat at their table, so I had built my own. And at my table, everyone was welcome, everyone was valued, and success was measured not by your last name, but by the quality of your work and the kindness in your heart.my degree. That heavy piece of paper had been relevant after all. It wasn't the key to a door, as I had once believed. It was a map that I had been forced to discard, but whose lessons had helped me navigate the wilderness of my own life, leading me not to the destination I had sought, but to a home I never knew I was looking for. And in that, I found a success more real and lasting than any corporate ladder could ever offer. Have you ever noticed how time doesn't really move in a straight line? We think it does, of course. We mark our calendars and celebrate our birthdays, counting the years as if they were neat little boxes stacked one on top of the other. But life isn't like that. It's more like a tangled thread, where a moment from 20 years ago can suddenly feel more real than yesterday. A scent, a sound, a face, and suddenly you're not just remembering, you're reliving. For me, the face was Mr. Albright's, aged and humbled, sitting in my diner. And the feeling it brought back wasn't the sting of his rejection, but the quiet, steady presence of my father's hand on my shoulder that evening, a silent promise that we would weather the storm together. Watching Mr. Albright walk away, a ghost from a past I had long since made peace with, I didn't feel a surge of victory. There was no "I showed him" moment. There was only a profound and quiet sense of gratitude. His dismissal, that casual act of cruelty, had been the catalyst for everything I now held dear. It had sent me down a path of rocks and thorns, but it was my path. It led me here, to this place filled with the smell of brewing coffee and baking bread, to a life built not on a corporate letterhead, but on the solid foundation of community and hard work. I realized then that my anger had been gone for a long time. I hadn't vanquished it in a grand battle. It had simply dissolved, molecule by molecule, with every pancake I flipped, every customer I served, and every time I saw the look of pride in my parents' eyes. Life at Ellie's place settled into a comfortable, bustling rhythm. We were more than a diner. We were Oak Haven's living room. It was where deals were shaken on, where teenagers had their first dates, where old friends gathered to escape the cold. My mother's presence was woven into the fabric of the place. She had a way with people, a gentle warmth that could soothe a crying baby or coax a story from the most tight-lipped old-timer. My father, retired from the garage, became our beloved handyman and unofficial greeter. He'd sit at the end of the counter for an hour each morning, nursing a coffee, his quiet, steady presence a comfort to me and our regulars. He'd talk about fishing with one customer, about the Buckeyes with another. He was happy, truly deeply happy. And seeing him like that, his hands finally clean of engine grease, was the greatest profit I could ever imagine. But the ghost of sterling manufacturing still loomed over our town. The decline that had begun with poor management years ago had accelerated. The layoffs came not in a flood, but in a slow, relentless trickle. First, the third shift was eliminated. Then an entire production line was shut down. Each announcement sent a ripple of fear through Oak Haven. For every worker laid off, a dozen other people felt the pinch: the grocery store, the hardware shop, and, of course, the diner. The change was subtle at first. The lunch rush was a little less rushed. People who used to order the steak dinner now opted for the soup and sandwich special. A husband and wife who had come in for breakfast every Saturday morning for years started coming in every other week. I saw the worry etched on the faces of my neighbors, the same look I had seen on my own face a decade earlier. They were good people, hard-working people who had played by the rules and were now being punished for the failures of men in offices on a hill. The irony was not lost on me. I couldn't just stand by and watch. My business degree had taught me about profit margins and loss leaders, but my life had taught me about community. One evening, after a particularly slow day, I sat down with my little profit-sharing family, Agnes, Brenda, and Carol. I laid the numbers out for them. "Things are getting tight," I said, my voice heavy. "Not just for us, but for everyone." Brenda, ever the pragmatist, immediately started talking about cutting hours. Carol looked worriedly at the menu, suggesting we raise prices. But it was Agnes, her hands dusted with flour, who spoke the truth we all felt. Raising prices on people who can't afford to eat is no way to stay in business. And sending your people home when they need the money most is no way to live. She was right. We weren't sterling manufacturing. We couldn't think like them. That night, we came up with a new plan. We introduced the Oak Haven plate, a simple, hearty, and deeply discounted meal of the day. It wasn't a big moneymaker, but it ensured that anyone could come in and get a hot, filling meal for just a few dollars. Then I took a small chalkboard and hung it by the cash register. I wrote "Pay it forward" at the top. The idea was simple. If you had a little extra, you could buy a coffee or a meal for a neighbor who was struggling. A customer could come in, pull a ticket off the board, and eat without a word, preserving their dignity. The board was slow to take off. But then, one day, my father, after finishing his morning coffee, quietly walked over and handed me a $5 bill. "Put that on the board, Ellie," he said. "For someone who needs it more than me." That small act seemed to break the dam. People started adding $1 or $2 to their bill. The board was soon covered in little paper tickets, each one a small testament to the town's stubborn kindness. Ellie's place became a beacon of resilience in a town drowning in uncertainty. We weren't just surviving, we were helping Oak Haven survive. But as our town fought its quiet battle, my family was about to face its own. My father, my rock, my quietest and most steadfast supporter, began to change. It started with small things. He'd forget a name or repeat a story he'd just told. He, who could diagnose an engine problem by its sound alone, now struggled to fix a wobbly table leg. His hands, which I had always seen as instruments of incredible skill and strength, began to tremble. My mother and I shared worried glances over his head, pretending not to notice a silent conspiracy of love and fear. The day he couldn't find his way home from the grocery store, a 5-minute walk he'd made 1,000 times, the pretense shattered. The diagnosis from the doctor was a cruel, clinical word that felt utterly inadequate to describe the slow, heartbreaking fading of the man I adored. Alzheimer's. The disease took from him piece by piece. First, it took his memories of recent events, then his ability to work in his beloved workshop. His frustration was a terrible thing to witness. This man, so capable and proud, would stare at a simple tool as if it were a foreign object, a deep confusion clouding his beautiful blue eyes. My life split in two. Half of me was the resilient business owner, fighting to keep my diner and my community afloat. The other half was the terrified daughter, watching her hero disappear before her very eyes. I would spend my days creating new specials and managing inventory, and my nights helping my mother coax my father to eat, or sitting with him as he stared at old photographs, trying to anchor him to a past that was slipping through his fingers like sand. One evening, during a rare moment of lucidity, he was sitting in his old armchair, holding the small, wooden bird he had carved for me when I was a little girl. He looked at it, then at me, his eyes clear and full of a profound sadness. "You did good, Ellie," he whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "You used your mind. But more than that, you used your heart. That's the part they can't teach you in school." He squeezed my hand, his grip surprisingly firm. "Don't ever let them make you small." Those were some of the last lucid words he ever spoke to me. A few months later, he passed away peacefully in his sleep. The silence he left behind was a physical presence. The house felt cavernous. His armchair was empty. His workshop was still and smelled of sawdust and memory. The diner felt wrong without him at the end of the counter. The entire town mourned with us. People I barely knew came to the funeral, sharing stories of my father's small acts of kindness, how he'd fixed a kid's bicycle for free, or given someone a ride in the rain. He had built a legacy not of wealth or status, but of decency. In the weeks that followed, grief was a fog I couldn't see through. The pressures of the diner, the town's economic woes, it all felt like too much. For the first time since I'd taken over, I felt the pull of defeat. I was exhausted, emotionally and physically. One night, sitting alone in the dark diner, I looked at the Pay It Forward board, now overflowing with tickets. And I just broke down. I put my head in my arms and wept, not just for my father, but for the sheer weight of it all. The back door creaked open. It was Agnes, holding 2 mugs of tea. She didn't say a word. She just sat with me, a silent, comforting presence, just as she had done all those years ago when I was a heartbroken girl. When my sobs subsided, she finally spoke. "Your father was a builder," she said softly. "He built things with his hands. He built a family with his heart. And he helped you build this place." She gestured around the quiet diner. "People don't just come here for the food, Eleanor. They come here because of what you've all built. Hope. It's the only thing this town has left, and it lives in here. You can't let that go." Her words, simple and true, cut through the fog of my grief. I had been so focused on what I had lost that I had forgotten what I still had. I had my mother, a woman of incredible fortitude. I had my diner family. And I had a community that, despite its struggles, had shown me nothing but love and support. My father's last words came back to me. Don't ever let them make you small. Grief was making me small. Fear was making me small. I had to be bigger than both. The next morning, I walked into the diner with a new resolve. The path forward was unclear, and the challenges were greater than ever. Sterling Manufacturing had just announced its final closure. The town's main artery was being severed. But as I looked at my mother, who was arranging flowers on the tables with a sad but determined grace, and at Brenda, who was already starting the coffee, I knew we weren't done. My father was a builder. And so was I. My work wasn't just to keep the diner running anymore. It was to help Oakhaven build something new from the rubble of its past. My personal struggle had become a public one, and I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I wouldn't face it alone. The day the whistles at Sterling Manufacturing fell silent for the last time, a quiet unlike any I had ever known settled over Oakhaven. It wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the hollow, breathless silence of a body after the heart has stopped beating. For generations, that factory's hum had been the town's lullaby, its alarm clock, its pulse. Now, there was nothing. The stillness was more deafening than the noise had ever been. You could feel the absence. It was in the empty parking lot that used to be crammed with cars and trucks, in the untraveled roads, in the drawn curtains of the houses on my street. It was the quiet of 5,000 people holding their breath at once, waiting for a future that had suddenly been erased. Ellie's place became a sanctuary in the storm. The diner, once a place for casual chatter and celebration, transformed into a town hall of the heartbroken. Men who had worked at Sterling for 40 years, men who had followed their fathers and grandfathers onto the factory floor, now sat at my counter, staring into coffee cups as if they held the answers to unanswerable questions. They weren't just out of a job, they were untethered from their identities. What am I supposed to do now, Ellie? A man named Tom, a welder whose hands were a roadmap of burns and scars, asked me one morning, his voice thick with a despair that went beyond money. It's all I've ever known. I didn't have the answers. But I had a warm room, hot coffee, and the Pay It Forward board, which was now more vital than ever. The board became a silent conversation of support. People who still had work, teachers, nurses, the few who commuted out of town, they would quietly add $5 or $10. The tickets would be taken just as quietly by those who needed them. There was no shame in it. We were all Oakhaven. We were all in it together. My mother, with her infinite well of empathy, would move from table to table, not with pity, but with a shared sense of sorrow, offering a kind word or just a comforting hand on a shoulder. We were serving more than food. We were serving dignity. But dignity doesn't pay the mortgage. As the weeks turned into months, for sale signs began to sprout on lawns like bitter weeds. Families started to leave, packing up their lives in search of work elsewhere. The high school graduating class, once a source of town pride, became a symbol of our exodus. The bright, hopeful young faces were all planning their escapes, with no intention of ever coming back. Oakhaven was dying. It was a slow, painful bleed out. One evening, after closing, I was sitting in my father's empty armchair at home, feeling the suffocating weight of it all. I thought of his words, "Don't ever let them make you small." The closing of the factory, the town's despair, it was making all of us small, shrinking our hopes and our futures. Agnes's words came back to me too. Your father was a builder. I looked at my hands. They weren't the soft, manicured hands of the girl who had walked into Mr. Albright's office. They were a waitress's hands, a baker's hands, a business owner's hands. They were strong. They were capable. It was time to build. My business degree had taught me about SWOT analysis, strengths, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. The threat was obvious. The weakness was our reliance on a single employer. But what were our strengths? I started making a list. We had a skilled workforce of machinists, electricians, welders, and mechanics. We had empty buildings and warehouses. But more than that, our strength was our people. We were stubborn. We were proud. We knew how to work hard. And we had each other. The next day, I put a sign in the diner window. Oak Haven Town Meeting. The future is in our hands. Wednesday, 7 p.m. All are welcome. I didn't ask the mayor. I didn't ask the town council. I just did it. That Wednesday night, the diner was packed. Every seat was taken, and people stood shoulder to shoulder, their faces a mixture of skepticism and desperate hope. I stood on a chair, my heart pounding, and I told them what I believed. I told them that waiting for another big company to come and save us was a fool's errand. We had to save ourselves. Look around this room, I said, my voice shaking but clear. Tom, you're the best welder in the state. Frank, you can fix any engine ever made. Mary, you ran the entire shipping department for Sterling. We have the skills right here. We don't have corporate offices on a hill, but we have workshops in our garages. We have kitchens. We have talent. What if we stopped waiting for jobs and started creating them ourselves? I proposed an idea, the Oak Haven Business Alliance, a cooperative of small, local businesses and craftspeople. We could pool our resources, share knowledge, and promote each other. We could turn the Made in Sterling legacy into a Made in Oak Haven revival. I used every bit of my business education, talking about microloans, shared marketing costs, creating a local brand. It was the most important presentation of my life, delivered not in a boardroom, but in a crowded diner that smelled of coffee and desperation. When I finished, there was a long silence. Then, old Tom the welder stood up. I can't build a business, Ellie, he said gruffly. I just know how to join metal. But I know how to write a business plan, Tom, I replied. And Brenda here knows how to do payroll. And my mom can make your booth at the farmer's market look like a palace. You don't have to do it alone. None of us do. Slowly, an idea took root. The alliance was born that night. It started small. Tom started a small custom welding shop, making ornate gates and railings. A group of laid-off seamstresses, organized by my mother, started a quilting cooperative. A former factory mechanic opened his own high-end auto repair shop. I turned a section of the diner into a small marketplace on weekends, a place for these new entrepreneurs to sell their wares without the cost of a storefront. Ellie's place became the incubator for Oak Haven's second act. My education wasn't just relevant, it was vital. It was the blueprint we were all using to rebuild our town, brick by painful, hopeful brick. One afternoon, during a slow lunch service, the bell above the door jingled. A man in his late 30s, looking thin and defeated, walked in. He wore a threadbare jacket and his eyes were downcast. It was Scott Albright, the cousin. The man who had gotten the job that was supposed to be mine. The symbol of everything I had once raged against. He looked years older than he was, the easy arrogance completely gone, replaced by a deep, weary shame. He walked to the counter and didn't look at me. He looked at the Pay It Forward board. He stood there for a long time before his shoulders slumped in defeat. He turned to leave. "Can I help you?" I asked, my voice gentle. He finally looked at me, and his eyes filled with a humiliated recognition. "Eleanor," he whispered. He expected scorn, I think. He expected me to gloat. Maybe a part of me, the ghost of the angry girl from years ago, wanted to. But I looked at him, and I didn't see the beneficiary of nepotism. I saw another casualty of Sterling's collapse. I saw another scared resident of Oak Haven. "Are you hungry?" I asked. He just nodded, unable to speak. "The Oak Haven plate today is shepherd's pie," I said, already getting him a plate. "Agnes made it. It's my father's recipe." I set it down in front of him at the counter. He stared at it as if he'd never seen food before. I can't pay," he stammered. I simply reached over, pulled a ticket from the board, and stuck it on the order spike. "Someone already did," I said softly. "Welcome to Ellie's place." He ate in silence, his shoulders shaking slightly. When he was done, he pushed the plate away and finally met my eyes. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick. "Everything. My father's investments, it was all tied up in the factory. We lost everything. I never learned how to do anything else." "Everyone has to learn something new now, Scott," I said, without malice. "What were you good at in school, before Sterling?" He looked surprised. I was always good at drawing. Architectural drafting." "There's a man who just started a custom cabinet business out of his garage," I said, wiping down the counter. He's looking for someone to help him with designs. His name is Mark. I can give you his number. In that moment, the last of the rocks crumbled. The cycle of bitterness was broken not by revenge, but by a simple act of grace. I had offered my enemy a hand up, not for him, but for myself. For my father. It was the only way to truly build something that lasts. Years have passed since that day. Oakhaven never became a boomtown again. The Sterling factory still stands, a hulking, silent monument to a bygone era. But the town is alive. The main street isn't full of chain stores, but of small, unique shops born from the Alliance. We have the Quilters Co-op, a craft brewery, a bakery, Tom's welding shop. Tourists come now, drawn by the Made in Oakhaven brand, a symbol of American resilience. The young people who leave for college? Some of them are starting to come back, bringing new ideas and new energy to the community we saved. My mother is still my partner, the heart and soul of the diner. Agnes finally retired, and her granddaughter, who has Agnes's hands and my father's love for baking, now makes the pies. Scott Albright designs beautiful kitchens for Mark's cabinet shop. He's a different man. Quieter. More humble. He eats at the diner once a week, and he always pays for his meal and adds $1 to the board. Sometimes, late at night, when the diner is quiet and I'm alone with the books, I take out my old diploma from the box where I keep it. That piece of paper that once felt so heavy with the weight of expectation, then with the weight of failure. It feels different now. It feels light. It wasn't a key to a locked door. It was a single tool in a toolbox I didn't know I had. My real education came from my father's quiet strength, my mother's boundless compassion, Agnes's tough wisdom, and the hard, beautiful, heartbreaking lessons of life itself. Mr. Albright was right about one thing. In the end, his cousin did get the job. And I thank God for that every day. Because by losing that job, I was free to find my true work. I didn't get to climb their corporate ladder. Instead, I got to build a foundation for my entire town. I didn't get the life I dreamed of. I got a life of purpose, a life of community, a life that was so much bigger and more meaningful. And that, I've learned, is a success no degree can define and no man can take away.